Okay, to help you with your research, I just wanted to give you some tips today on using focus groups. These are groups of people that you get together to find out about their opinions and attitudes, for example, to review a piece of work, or just basically provide some collective input to help you with whatever you're researching. First of all, how large should a focus group be? Well, I would say that an ideal number of participants is around 6 or 7. If it's any bigger, what quite often happens is they break into side conversations and the focus is lost. If it's any smaller, you may not get the range of views that you need to get a really good discussion. Secondly, it's important that you have a moderator for the group who's able to facilitate and guide the discussions. The moderator must ensure that everyone participates and stop anyone dominating. And also, the moderator needs to make sure that the discussions don't go off in the wrong direction. And thirdly, in order to help the group focus on what's required, some basic materials should be used, particularly to kick-start the discussions. This may be in the form of pictures, photos, diagrams, graphs, etc., and will help the group to understand the context of what needs to be discussed.
The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant, but it gets worse when you listen up close.
It does for most people, but for me, it actually just makes me excited.
Omar Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech.
I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab.
Inan's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus.
If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore, but I would also sometimes feel that I would feel this basically catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee.
A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees to eavesdrop as their legs bend?
What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other during those movements.
He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic and more irregular in an injured knee than in a healthy one, which Inan says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery. Details appear in the IEEE transactions on biomedical engineering.
The primary application we're targeting at first is to give people a decision aid during rehabilitation following an acute knee injury to help them understand when they can perform particular activities and when they can move to different intensities of particular activities.
A useful thing to take a crack at.
So this is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot. But I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, finished. That had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So Even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labour, and that is their primary purpose in society.
My PTE Academy.
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man. Over a period of almost 50 years, he was a literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and dedicated journal keeper.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their own adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
Good morning, class. It's a beautiful spring day outside, isn't it? We'll soon be seeing the first robin of spring, and so, it's a perfect day to begin talking about migration. Migration is the main strategy that animals have for avoiding adverse environments and taking advantage of rich environments. Of course, there are other strategies, too. Hibernation, for example, but far and away the most common way for animals to escape poor conditions and get to better ones is by migration, a mass journey from one place to the other. Now there are all kinds of migrations, but the most familiar one is the sort that our robins will be experiencing, a seasonal, latitudinal migration. In the fall, the birds fly south, and in the spring they fly north again. In the southern hemisphere, of course, this works in the opposite direction. In both hemispheres, migrants move toward the equator when the Earth chills and toward the poles when it warms. This is the way that species have been able to colonize, to use those subpolar resources that are seasonally difficult to access, that are unavailable to many living things for half the year. Birds are certainly the most conspicuous latitudinal migrants, and they're also the most awesome. Most famously, the Arctic tern, which is a small seabird, migrates from one pole to the other, all the way from the Arctic subpolar region to the Antarctic subpolar region and back again annually. These birds travel roughly 70,000 kilometers a year. My next topic I'm sure will interest all of you. I want to talk to you now about black holes. Simply speaking, a black hole is what's left after a large star dies. You're already aware that a star is an energy producer. A nuclear fusion reactor, its core is a gigantic nuclear fusion bomb that's trying to explode, but its mass of surrounding gases is so large that its gravity contains the explosion, and the balance that exists between the gravity and the fusion is what determines the star's size. However, as a star gets older, as it ages, its fuels gets used up and its nuclear reactor slows down. And then, its gravity gets the upper hand. The star implodes. Gravity pulls inward and compresses the stellar material into the star's center. As it's compressed, the core heats up tremendously, and then, at some point, a supernova, a great explosion, occurs, and the stellar material and a lot of radiation are blasted out into space. Only the extremely dense, extremely massive core is left. Its gravitational field is so strong that nothing can escape it, not even light. So it disappears from view. It's black. It's now a black hole.
Smoking any kind of cigarette, including menthol cigarettes, is harmful and increases risk for serious illness and death. Studies have shown that menthol in cigarettes likely leads people, especially young people, to experiment with smoking. It also could increase a young person's risk of becoming dependent on nicotine. Compared to adults who smoke non-menthol cigarettes, adults who smoke menthol cigarettes make more attempts to quit smoking and have a harder time quitting. Marketing messages imply that menthol cigarettes are a healthier alternative. This is not true. Menthol cigarettes are just as dangerous as
Honey is a naturally pure and safe food. Because it has a high sugar content, mild acidity, and a low moisture level, microorganisms cannot grow in honey. It never needs pasteurization. Raw honey is essentially the same product that the bees have produced. It naturally contains enzymes, vitamins and grains of pollen. The color, flavor and even aroma of honey differs, depending on the nectar of flowers visited by the bees that made it. There are more than 300 unique types of honey available in the United States alone, each originating from a different floral source. Their shades range from nearly colorless to dark brown, while flavors go from subtle to bold. Even the aroma of honey may be reminiscent of the flower. As a general rule, the flavor of light-colored honeys is milder, and the flavor of darker-colored honey is stronger. Varietal honeys may be best compared to wine in terms of climatic changes. Even the same flower blooming in the same location may produce slightly different nectar from year to year, depending on temperature and rainfall.